In this session, we're going to be going through the Gold Coast City area, and we're going to be reviewing the leading indicators around supply and demand and what's driving the economy there as well. As always, the usual advice disclaimer: please don't take anything within this video as specific financial advice. I strongly encourage you to speak to a financial advisor, an accountant, legal professional, and mortgage broker to discuss your specific goals, financial situation, and needs before making any financial decisions. Looking at the Gold Coast area over a 3 and 12-month time frame, you can see there that the majority of the Gold Coast, especially in the south of the Gold Coast area there, has had a little bit of a decline, and in some areas it has had meager growth of less than 3%. Looking over a 12-month basis, we can see that some areas, especially stretching towards Upper Coomera, has been growing by greater than 12%. The remainder of the Gold Coast is between 6 and 12% there. Currently, rents are sitting around the $1,100 per week mark when we look at houses, with the remainder of some of the northern Gold Coast areas bordering up to about $1,000 per week. And then in the Coomera area, there's some areas that are around about $1,100 per week as well. In terms of overall rental growth, has been around about 5% or up to 5% in most areas, with some areas having 5 to 10% and a few areas with 10 to 15% in rental growth. In terms of property price growth, you can see there that the majority of the time over the last 15 odd years, there hasn't been much growth in the Gold Coast area, with house prices sitting between 5 and 600,000 there. And then when we had the conclusion of COVID, property prices rose to 750, and then they sat at around about the $8-9 to $1 million mark, depending on what demographic you're looking at, whether it's houses or three bedders. And since 2024, over the last couple of years, property prices have climbed up to about 1.4 million there. Similar story with the vacancy rates. Vacancy probably sat at a long-term average of around about 2.5% there. It fell from, you can see here, it fell from probably halfway through 2013 to 2020. There was a high vacancy peak here at the beginning of COVID. However, by far and large, the vacancy rate has been relatively tight, with the majority of the time frame during COVID sitting at less than 1% there. However, it's sat at a new average at around about 1.2% since the end of COVID, at around about 2023 onwards. In terms of overall rental yield, you can see for the majority of time that the rental yield has been sitting at around about the 5% mark up until 2022. However, since we've seen capital growth exceed rental growth, you can see that the rental yield has reduced as a result. Now we're looking at around about 4% rental yield for a house in the Gold Coast area. And you can see that reflected in the rental amount. From around about 2021 onwards, you can see rental growth has risen from around about $500 to $600 per week, all the way up to over $1,000 a week, with homes on average having around about $1,100 per week in rent. And then for 3-bedroom homes, you're looking at about $900 per week in rent. Overall, property listings have fallen pretty sharply from around about 2021. There was a bit of a dip from 2019 onwards. However, the dip has been a lot sharper since then, falling to just over about 6,000 property listings overall. And it's remained that way since, even falling to about 5,000 property listings towards the end of 2025 there. Prior to that, you're probably looking at around about 10,000 as an average number of property listings in the Gold Coast region. Similar story for rental listings. Since 2021, you probably had an average of around about 2,000, give or take about 1,000. You can see that for the period of 2014 through to 2018, you had about 1,500 rental listings. However, that's climbed back up over the 2018 to 2020, even into halfway through 2020 there, where it climbed back up to about an average of 2,300 there. However, since COVID, the vacancy rate has fallen. For the period between 2021 and 2023, we had less than 1,000 rental listings overall, and that average has crept up slightly to around about 1,300 or 1,400 rental listings. But by far and large, it's much lower than the long-term historical average. Funnily enough, though, in the Gold Coast area, you can see the peaks aren't during Christmas time. They're actually during the winter season, which makes sense for a coastal sunshine area. Population growth has historically been relatively good. You can see in 2014, we were probably about 550,000, and now in 2024, we're looking at around about 650,000, growth of about 100,000 over a 10-year period. This equates to about 1.8% year on year in population growth. Average job growth has been around about 3%, and you can see over the last couple of years that has been relatively high in the Gold Coast, which has actually exceeded the Queensland average. It's fallen in 2024 to just below the average annual growth rate. And in terms of unemployment, it sits well below the regional Queensland and Australian averages at less than 4%. The value of total building approvals has fallen in recent years. However, in the 2025-26 financial year to date, you can see we're only at September, and already we're sitting at around about 40% of the last year's total. The Gold Coast area has great diversity of employment, with about 80% sitting amongst about a dozen different industries there. And your riskier industries like mining and agriculture don't even feature very highly. So thank you everybody for watching. I hope you've taken something away from this video. If you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Otherwise, if you want to speak in detail about buying investment property, please don't hesitate to book in a meeting using the link below. Thanks again. Have a great day.